Hello, welcome back. Today is the final lecture for this class, final educational lecture. I hope you guys enjoyed the course, and I hope that you guys learned a lot about individual diseases and individual infectious diseases and what they are and how they actually affect the global public health programs in developing world. Today, what we're going to discuss is a couple of diseases in which there is the first one we're going to talk about is smallpox, is a disease that has actually been eradicated and has the first disease to be eradicated as a global health effort in the last 30, 40 years. And then we're going to talk about another disease that is targeted for elimination and eradication in the coming years. So let's just get started. So we're going to talk about smallpox first. So what is smallpox? Smallpox is a disease that's been around for a very, very long time. They've even found Egyptian mummies, for instance, that have had smallpox. You can actually see on the cheeks of the mummy here the little marks, and that's because this mummy actually had smallpox. And that's one of the major characteristics of smallpox are these bumps, and I'll show you a couple slides in a little bit. That's more pronounced in living humans, photographs of living humans at the time. But it has been around for a long time. It's been described in India as the severe pain is felt in large and small joints with cough, shaking, listlessness, and languor. The palate, lips, and tongue are dry, and there's thirst and no appetite. That's kind of a very generic definition of what the disease is. Again, that's not that much different. What separates it are these pustules of red, yellow, and white that are accompanied by burning pain. It's these pustules that are the characteristic hallmark of smallpox. The best equivalent that I can come up with right now that you might have seen is chickenpox, but chickenpox it's a different disease, completely different family of diseases, and it's also it doesn't necessarily kill people, at least in the developed world. So here are some of the images. As I mentioned before, smallpox is eradicated, so these pictures are 40 years old now from previous cases, and then you can see how severe it gets. It's not necessarily only on the face. It's can go on the limbs of the individuals infected, but the face is kind of like one of the hallmark areas where you do get infected. Um, the history continues on. So you've seen it in Mecca, you've seen it in Mexico in the conquests. One of the interesting things about smallpox is that even in American history, it's disrupted the colonial army. So it has had major effects on the history of the world as well. Outbreaks have stopped armies from moving forward. There's a great example I always say of with smallpox of being used as a biological warfare, that they knew that it was deadly and they knew more or less how it spread. There's a famous general was in the British Army at the time, colonial army, and his name was General Amherst, and he was famous for providing blankets to the Indians that were infected with smallpox, and that's kind of a level of biowarfare that was used, and actually Amherst, Massachusetts is named after that general because he was considered a hero at the time, and now probably looking back historically, people would reconsider that think. But continuing on, the main strategy up till about the 1700s was a term called variolation, in which you basically take the dried out pustules from a person infected, and you would basically take those dried out pustules, take a very little bit, and infect someone else who's not been infected, and they may survive, they may not. But it was about a three. Here we go. It's about a 2.5% fatality rate, which is fairly low, but still extremely high when you actually consider if you were to do this as a mass public health effort. Uh, it was yeah. So I just talked about that. So continuing on. So it was Jenner who noticed in 1796 that you can actually take pustules rather than from an infected human with smallpox, but rather you can take pustules from a cow, a person that's been infected by a cow. And what he noticed is that milkmaids, women who would milk the cows, would often get these pustules, a very smaller form of smallpox, which was actually cowpox, and they would be able to survive the smallpox epidemics that would come through without getting infected because they were effectively immunized against the smallpox because the cowpox. There was cross reactivity between the two, and so what Jenner did was he took cowpox from an infected milkmaid and injected it into this boy, James Phillips, in 1796. And then what he did today would not be considered acceptable. He basically inoculated this boy with smallpox later on and found out that the boy survived. So this was kind of the first example of a vaccination that was used. Not the true vaccination in the term that we think of today, where it's an engineered type of vaccine, but this was the first example of it, and this was called variolation, is the specific term for that. As time went on, the smallpox vaccination programs actually advanced fairly quickly from 1796. In 1805, they were using the virus on the flank of the calf, so they were basically extracting the cowpox from these cows to vaccinate people. And by the Civil War in the United States, publicity about the vaccine production was at the medical congress and basically was starting to get accepted within the medical framework to be as a method that was used. By World War I, most of Europe was smallpox-free as a result of these. By World War II, transmission was interrupted in Europe and North America. The big advancement in the smallpox vaccine was the development of the stable freeze-dried vaccine by Collier. And now we're talking about true vaccines. Now we're talking about engineered vaccines, not just cowpox or smallpox derivatives. And it was from that point that they realized if they could actually get the stable form of the virus, they could actually theoretically try to vaccinate millions of people, not just hundreds of thousands, not just people that were easily accessible, but because you could get now to the most remote places of the world, you could theoretically, the idea of eradication was starting to develop. And after World War II, with the United Nations and the World Health Organization being formulated, these concepts were starting to evolve. And what they realized in 1945 was that smallpox was fairly still endemic in pretty much most of the world. But by 1950, these organizations were starting to form. The Pan American Sanitary Organization, which evolved into the Pan American Health Organization, decided to undertake the eradication of the Western Hemisphere in 1950 already. So that was a long time ago. In 1959, the World Health Assembly, which is an assembly within the United Nations World Health Organization, adopted the goal to eradicate smallpox. So 10 years after the Americas decided to do it, the UN said that the entire world could do this. And in 1966, the Assembly decided to intensify eradication and provide more funds. This was when they realized that this could actually be done in our lifetime and very quickly if the world worked together. What was necessary for this to happen? So there are a couple factors that are absolutely critical for the ability to eradicate a disease. And I should have mentioned this in the first place, but this I think is a good place to mention it. The first one is that humans are essential for the life cycle. The second one is that you need practical diagnostic tools, and the third one is effective intervention capable of interrupting transmission. So let's go at each point a little bit more in detail. The first point is essential for the human life cycle. If at all possible, you want one that only infects humans. If you have a reservoir like a mosquito or a dog that it can hide out in, it makes it much more difficult to eradicate. Not impossible, but much more difficult to eradicate. The way you can eradicate it is by interrupting the transmission cycle. And you would do this by basically trying to vaccinate enough people in the world that basically the virus or bacteria or parasite cannot travel from one person to the next within the given life cycle of its natural life cycle. So it has to have one person infected, say, in one village, and if that person stays in that village and travels to another village, that the time of that travel needs to be longer than the natural life cycle of the infection. So that's what's critical. And then it has to have practical diagnostic tools. To be able to detect, make sure that you have actually reached eradication, you are looking for people not infected. And in order to look for people not infected, you have to have very, very sensitive tests to do that. Because you can have a person that's infected but not clinically showing symptoms, and so if they have a very low infection, they might be still in their blood and they may be infectious to other people, but they may not be showing clinical symptoms, so that's not a good characteristic to use. You need to have some kind of diagnostic, molecular diagnostic at best, to be able to tell whether they've actually been infected and whether the infection is going on. So with that in mind, the programs moved forward. In 1967, you can see here that the programs were moving forward fairly well. Most of the Americas was removed from endemicity. You had a couple of imported cases in Argentina, but it was still endemic in Brazil. Africa still had a lot of endemic countries, as well as Southeast Asia. Most of the European countries were also just imported cases. Two other factors that made the eradication of smallpox extremely important. We mentioned the freeze-dried smallpox vaccine, but the other one is the bifurcated needle. And if you can see here in the picture on the right, it's a very, very small needle. And what people did was basically they take that needle and they stick it in the tube for the smallpox vaccine. And that tube holds a couple of microliters, I think 1 to 2 microliters of vaccine. And you just poke people with it. And that poke basically creates just a little bit of a what's the word I want to say? A laceration in the skin, and that's just enough of the virus, the incapacitated virus, the attenuated virus. I think in this case, smallpox was a dead virus, to actually go into the bloodstream and create an immune response. By today's standard, this would never be allowed because of what's happening with HIV and other infections that can be spread through blood transmission. But people were not really considering it at that time as an issue. So they would basically reuse the same needle from many, many people. Today, that would never be allowed, and you would never be able to use the same tube of vaccine. A mil tube could vaccinate, 150, 200 people, and they would just reuse that for all the people taking the same needle, dipping it in the tube with the vaccine, poking a person, dipping it in the tube, poking it, and so on. Today, that would never be allowed. You need a separate tube, you need a separate syringe for each individual you vaccinate. So the eradication strategy that they were using was developed by a person by the name of D.A. Henderson and Bernie Moss. And these two gentlemen were very, very important in the design of it. When you think about how the program actually worked by today, you would think, oh, well, that makes sense. It's logical to do that. But this was never done before. So it had to be completely thought out. And the basically way they did it is they did mass vaccination campaigns in each country using the vaccine to about an 80%. If they could get higher than 80%, they would have liked that, of the population. And then they developed a system to detect and contain cases and outbreaks. And the way they did this is if they saw a case, after they've done these mass campaigns, if they saw a case, they would basically vaccinate that case. They would vaccinate everyone that was around that case, so everyone that had contact with that person, their family, their friends, and then they would vaccinate on top of that the contacts of the contacts. So the friends of the friends, anyone who could theoretically have a contact. The Ebola outbreaks in 2014 and 2015 in Western Africa is another good example of how they were able to contain Ebola. As they isolated rather than vaccinating, since there is no vaccine for Ebola at this time. They basically isolated everyone that had the contacts to the case, and then they monitored the contacts to the contacts for any symptoms for 28 days. So this is just an image. Took this from the World Health Organization, but this is what they looked like with the mass vaccination campaigns. Basically, they did community awareness messaging before the campaign, so they would say, in a month, in 2 days, and 1 day, tomorrow, we're going to be having this mass campaign. Please come down to the village medical place, and we'll vaccinate you at the same time as. And they did a lot of other health issues. They did polio vaccinations at the same time and other vaccinations, just so that they didn't come all the way out to the health center just for simply for the smallpox vaccine. But this is what it looked like, and they came out in the thousands. And you can see the progression here of how smallpox actually works and the way they would monitor it after the vaccinations. Very simply, they would look for the first couple of days. They would be looking for the fever and the rash. But as time went on, they would be looking for pustules and scabs, and that's how they actually monitored it. And you can see that the period of the rash lasted up to 21 days. That 21-day period is critical because I mentioned before, you need to monitor how long it could take from the virus to get from one person to the next. So in order to see if the person was infected on the day they left the village, they would need 21 days, basically. It would take them longer than 21 days to get infected to the next village. If they infected that person in that village, they would also need 21 days from the point that they were infected. So in order to guarantee that you've actually reached an elimination, you should be monitoring for double the life cycle of the actual infection. And so in this case, 42 days. So that's the reason why a lot of people would say, you need to monitor the Ebola for 21 days or 28 days, is because the life cycle is 14 days, and so on. And then the last case is a smallpox. There was two major cases. The last of the last cases, the last case in Asia was in 1975 in Bangladesh, and then the last case of the last case of Ebola that was discovered was in Somalia in 1977. And so what ended up happening is they did have two confirmed acquired cases in the UK in 78, but the last confirmed, if you want to call it wild type, was discovered in 1977. After that case, they continued monitoring and evaluation for several years just to make sure that the virus was completely gone. They had to do the laboratory testing, the monitoring to ensure that they got certification, and the certification process took several years. And it was only in 1980 that they actually declared smallpox eradicated, and that was because they needed full certification to be able to do that. And that takes a long time. So why do we still worry about smallpox? The major reason is because of that it's eradicated, but it's not extinct. There are still some theoretically case vials of smallpox. The Russians, when it was the Soviet Union, produced tons of the stuff in theory of making biological weapons. They've said they've destroyed all those samples, but you never know. And then the CDC in Atlanta is known to have some small samples for laboratory research settings. Having said that, even if they decide to destroy it, the genetic sequence is known. It's published. And it's today, by today's technological ability, you can actually clone from scratch, fusing all the DNA sequences. You can actually fuse the entire genome together to make smallpox again. In reality, it's very difficult to do that. It's not as easy as just taking the DNA, fusing it all together in the correct sequence, putting it in a virus shell, and then reproducing it in a biological weapon. It's much more complicated. However, the technology moves pretty fast, and if someone is dedicated enough, they will find a way. So those are the reasons that you need to be concerned about this, the smallpox vaccine. Smallpox virus. Still, having said that, don't go crazy being worried about it. It's very difficult and unlikely to happen. There's easier if you're going to develop, but if you're a terrorist and you want to do something like this, it requires so much time and money. It's easier just to make a bomb and blow people up. I hate to say it that way, but that's the simple reality of it. I've taken a couple of been to enough lectures on bioterrorism. If you guys ever have the chance and you go to this, the Centers for Strategic Intelligence, some of these think tanks in Washington, D.C. have a lot of these talks about different diseases and how they can eradicate them. And that was one of the subjects that came up, but very interesting, but side note anyway. So that's smallpox. That is now eradicated. So the next disease we're going to discuss is guinea worm disease. Guinea worm disease is not eradicated at this point in time. It is one of the ones that is targeted for eradication. Unlike smallpox, which is a virus, this is a parasitic disease. It's a worm, and it is also very ancient. It's been known in the ancient texts. It's been found in mummies. It is a waterborne disease rather than respiratory disease or fecal oral. So this one is actually spread in contaminated pools of water, and I'll go into detail a little bit more, but it's caused by a roundworm. Don't need to know the name of the specific species. There is no vaccine, as I mentioned before, nor is there a medical cure. There's no drugs available, and there's no immunity to infection. So how do you actually get rid of this disease? It's very, very interesting in the way that this eradication program has developed over time. The life cycle is, you see the little parasite on the left, and what ends up happening is you actually would drink contaminated water. Over time, the larvae are released, and they slowly grow into adult worms as they travel down your leg. This can take about a year for this whole process to happen as it migrates through your body. And what will end up happening is it'll travel down to your leg, and you'll get this extreme burning sensation in your foot, and you want to cool it off. And so you put your foot in the water, and what ends up happening is when your foot touches the water, the nice cool water, the parasite knows to basically burrow out of your skin into the water again and continue the life cycle. It's extremely painful. It's not a very fun disease to have, and if you have some time to look into it, there were some of the guest lectures, the student lectures that we had on the individual disease presentations. They talked about the disease, and they'll go a little bit more into detail about the disease life cycle. And I think if you have the opportunity to listen to those, I would have greatly advised that. So the criteria for eradication for this disease is that there's the natural history of the disease is known. That's also critical. You need to know, again, I mentioned that you can't have an animal reservoir, that humans should be the only host, that also that the diagnosis is fairly easy and that identification is easy, but also that the clinical symptom presentation is well defined, and this particular one has well-known local languages. People know what the disease is. The seasonal occurrence, it makes it much more easy to identify. So identifying that you actually have the disease is easy, which makes theoretical prevention strategies easy. And that's the key to this disease, is the prevention strategies. They've done some cost analysis, and they've demonstrated that the economic return for eradication is there. So from that, I'm also, same thing with the smallpox and any disease, you need to prove that it's economically beneficial for the eradication, not just that it's, so that way you have support at a political level, not just, from a scientific, let's get rid of this disease level. You need that political will, because it does take long periods of time for these type of things to happen. In 1980, the CDC, U.S. Centers for Disease Control, suggested that eradication for the disease, because it's only transmitted through drinking water, it would be an ideal indicator of the success of the programs for water as well. So you can use other monitoring systems to be able to determine how one program works for another. In 1986, the WHO, World Health Assembly, adopted the resolution to eradicate the disease, and they formulated with the Carter Center, the Guinea worm eradication program. The Carter Center in Atlanta is one of the major centers that's basically heading this whole program up. And the way they do this is through these interventions, primarily surveillance, case detection and containment. Again, the same thing as what was going on with Ebola outbreak. If you see a case, make sure you contain them, make sure they do not go into the water, try to avoid that, to continue the life cycle. You want to try to kill the parasite as it comes out of the foot rather than allowing it to escape. Health education and community mobilization, making sure that if you don't contain it, just making sure that people in the villages know that if they end up with this disease, that they shouldn't go into the water to continue the life cycle. And then vector control using larvicide. There is no drug that the person can take to kill the disease, but there are larvicides, there are pesticides that they can put in the water. Having said that, it makes the water not necessarily as safe to drink, so they do have to provide safe sources of drinking water as a result. And how they do that is primarily through borehole wells. This is in Africa, but there's most of these countries, well, actually all the countries now are in Africa that have this disease, that have it left. And so they just provide them with safe drinking water through wells. Rivers and streams, make sure that they're flowing water, make sure that because the parasite tends to hang out on stagnant water, so make sure they're only drinking from rivers and streams that are flowing. And then advocate for safe water supplies, and then in any village that is endemic. What has worked very, very well, and this is probably the biggest saver of the program, is simple filters. Unlike other viruses or bacteria, they're fairly large parasites. So even just a 100 by 100 micron nylon mesh cloth filter, effectively just almost like cheesecloth, can prevent the parasite from actually getting in. So you basically, any water that you use, you will add this mesh to the faucet to prevent or mesh it over the water as you're dipping it through the container as on the right. And that will pretty much get most of the cocopods out. The cocopods being the little parasites that you saw that looked like a little fish in the earlier picture. Another way you can do it is, and these could get a little expensive, but since there's so few villages left in the world that are endemic for this is now the primary way they're doing it, is using these water pipes. You actually can find these in camping stores if you wanted to, these life straws. and they can clean the water out fairly well and prevent the parasite from spreading. And that's just a way that you can do it. You can drink straight from dirty water. I personally wouldn't do it, but I mean, if you have no other choice, if that's your water supply, then that's what you have available. So it's better than nothing. And then case containment is the last strategy. And to do this is you have to basically, again, if you see anyone that has the worm that's starting to come out, you have to make sure that they do not come in the water, that they did not enter the water, and if they did enter the water, make sure you provide the larvicide to try to kill anything that got into that water. And then you want to contain that and watch them for 7 more days until after the worm completely emerges. Once that's done, after the 7 days, that person is no longer infected with that particular cycle of the parasite, so they should be free of it. And that's pretty much the way it's done. The larvicide that's used is fairly effective, but it can be unsafe for drinking water. So it should be used primarily in just areas where there's no drinking water, where people might be using it for washing clothes or bathing or things like that. Health education, just mentioned this, preventing water contamination, making sure that they use the water filters, and then informing them about the pros and cons about the particular larvicides that are available. Using village health workers is how you would actually do this. So, the NGO, the Carter Center, is not going to every single village to describe how to do this. What they do is it's called a training of trainers. And what they'll do is they'll train many people that are in country, and those people go to every single village. So it's the local people actually educating the local people about what the issues are. And that's not uncommon with beyond just guinea worm infection. That's a lot of different programs use that strategy. And you can see here that from the 1980s all the way till present, this is 2009, the program has been extremely effective. You had hundreds of thousands of cases per year back in the 80s, and it's dropped down to less than 100. They're getting about 100 cases a year. Last year, I think it was 128 total cases throughout the world. So they're getting very, very close in the number of cases that are being reported to eradication. And there's only a couple of countries left that actually have it. And most of these cases are, if you can see here that they're in the blue, most of them are imported cases from other countries. Really, the only areas that have it right now are South Sudan, some cases in Niger, but it's very, very, very few cases left. Most of the cases are in South Sudan. The rest of the cases, if there are cases, they're usually imported from other countries. So how do you demonstrate that you've actually interrupted the transmission? First, you have to have an adequate surveillance system that you've confirmed absence for over 3 years. And you have to have a rumor log of suspected cases to maintain for more than 3 years. All alleged cases need to be investigated and contained if they are confirmed. And any imported cases have to be traced and contained. You have to, again, it's very similar to what happened with the smallpox method, is you have to see the cases, anyone who had contact with those cases, any water supply those people went to, and you have to double check those to make sure that they haven't been contaminated. And then the process for certification of eradication, again, is a very, very long process. It's very bureaucratic, but it's how the WHO works, how many organizations work. But first, the country must demonstrate that they've interrupted it. Then they have to have an international certification team that visits the country and assesses the surveillance, reviews the records, conducts case searches, and writes a report for consideration to WHO. The country must submit an additional report detailing the history of the eradication campaign, and then the WHO recommends to the Director General whether the country should be certified for the eradication. It's the Director General who actually makes that formal announcement for the eradication. This is global now, for global eradication, and then they would also do it as and every individual country makes their own particular elimination/eradication. And that's it for today. It's a great, infectious diseases are very, very interesting diseases. Next week I'm just gonna, I'll highlight some of the points that we had in our discussions, and I hope that would kind of take this whole class into a nice little circle, and I'm looking forward to your final papers. Your final exams will be also distributed soon, and those, I don't want to make it very difficult. I kind of want it to be more of just the, proof of principle that you guys understand the major concepts. So I wouldn't go crazy about that. Again, it's your major paper that you need to make sure you focus on, and the presentation that you're going to give on that paper as well. So just again, thank you again for being in the class, and I hope you enjoyed it. And good luck in your future.